At 10:18 a.m. August 30th, 1943, First Lieutenant Kenneth Ambrose Walsh pushed the throttle of his Vought F4U Corsair forward as the tropical heat shimmered over the Solomon Islands. Below him, the dark green jungle of Vella La Vella stretched to the horizon. Above him, scattered cumulus clouds drifted at 14,000 feet. Walsh was 27 years old, flying his 103rd combat mission with Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-124, one of the first units to take the Corsair into combat. What began as a routine patrol would soon turn into one of the most lopsided aerial engagements of the Pacific War. Walsh's aircraft, Bureau number 02350, carried the distinctive inverted gull wings of the Corsair, wings designed to house a massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and 2,350 rounds of ammunition. The Corsair was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything the Imperial Japanese Navy could field. But it had one flaw: it demanded absolute discipline from the pilot. At low speeds, the aircraft could kill the careless. Many Marine aviators never survived their first carrier landing attempts. Walsh had mastered it. By late summer 1943, the air war over the Solomons had reached a critical phase. Japanese forces were retreating north, but their air units remained aggressive. Large formations of Mitsubishi M0 fighters continued to challenge American control of the skies, relying on numbers, maneuverability, and veteran pilots hardened by years of combat over China and the Pacific. Intelligence estimated that Japanese fighter sweeps now routinely exceeded 20 aircraft at a time. Walsh had already made a name for himself. Between April and August, he had shot down 18 enemy aircraft, becoming the first Corsair ace in history. Unlike many fighter pilots, Walsh did not rely on tight turns or reckless pursuit. His tactics were brutally simple: altitude, speed, and decisive firepower. Dive, fire, break away, never turn with a zero, never give the enemy a second chance. On this morning, Walsh was alone. Radio traffic crackled briefly, then fell silent. Friendly aircraft were scattered across the region, tied down escorting bombers and transport flights. Walsh's fuel gauge showed 238 gallons, enough for roughly 2 hours of flight at cruise power. His ammunition counters were full. Visibility was excellent. Conditions favored combat. Then he saw them. 20 or more blackspakes appeared to the northeast, climbing rapidly out of the haze. Walsh counted quickly: 2 groups, then 3. The shapes resolved into Mitsubishi A6M0s, their long wings and rounded wingtips unmistakable. The formation was spreading, climbing aggressively, a classic Japanese fighter sweep, searching for American aircraft to destroy. Walsh checked his altitude: 15,500 feet. The Zeros were below him, climbing through 12,000. Their advantage was numbers. His advantage was position. Standard doctrine dictated disengagement. 1 pilot against 20 fighters was suicide. Walsh could radio a contact report and retreat south. Reinforcements might arrive in 20 minutes. By then, the Japanese formation would have already attacked ground targets or intercepted American bombers. Walsh did not turn away. He pushed the Corsair's nose down slightly, building speed. Manifold pressure climbed. The massive radial engine roared. The aircraft accelerated past 320 miles per hour. The Zeros had not seen him yet. Their pilots were focused forward, scanning the empty sky. Walsh selected his target, the rear element of the formation, and rolled into a shallow dive with the sun behind him. 1 Corsair, more than 20 Zeros, no backup. The attack was about to begin. Walsh rolled the Corsair inverted and pulled gently, aligning himself behind the trailing Japanese fighters. Airspeed climbed rapidly: 340, 360 miles per hour. The F4U shuddered slightly as compressibility effects began to build, but the aircraft remained solid. Below him, the Zero formation flew loose and confident, their pilots unaware that death was falling out of the sun. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a lethal opponent in 1943. Lightweight, extraordinarily maneuverable, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots, it dominated turning engagements below 20,000 feet. Powered by a Nakajima Sake engine, producing roughly 1,130 horsepower, the Zero could outturn any American fighter in the Pacific. What it could not do was absorb damage. It had no armor plate, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal structural reinforcement. One well-placed burst was often enough. Walsh closed to 800 yards. The Zero still hadn't reacted. At 600 yards, he armed his guns. At 400, he fired. 6.50 caliber Brownings erupted at once, the Corsair vibrating violently as a stream of tracers converged on the last aircraft in the formation. The round struck the Zero's left wing root and engine cowling. Aluminum skin tore open, fuel ignited instantly. The Japanese fighter rolled inverted and disintegrated in a sheet of flame before the pilot could react. Walsh didn't follow it down. He never did. He pulled up hard, 6 Gs pressing him into the seat, and rolled right, slicing across the formation's path. The Japanese pilots reacted instantly. Brake turns erupted in every direction. Formation discipline vanished. Radios crackled with shouted warnings. White vapor trails traced frantic evasive maneuvers across the sky. The element of surprise was gone, but the damage was done. Walsh zoomed back up to altitude, trading speed for height. The Corsair climbed like an elevator. Behind him, 3 Zeros attempted to follow, but they stalled out below 14,000 feet. The F4U's engine gave Walsh a vertical advantage they couldn't match. At the top of the climb, Walsh rolled again and dove back in. This time, the Zeros saw him coming. Two fighters turned directly into his path, attempting a head-on pass. Closing speed exceeded 700 miles per hour. Tracers flashed past Walsh's canopy. He fired a short, disciplined burst. 1 Zero snapped into a violent roll, trailing smoke. The second flashed past, so close Walsh saw the pilot's goggles. He broke left, then down, using gravity and speed. The Corsair surged past 400 miles per hour in the dive. The Zeros tried to follow, but they couldn't. Their wings began to buffet. Control surfaces stiffened. One pilot pulled too hard and spun away. Walsh leveled out at 9,000 feet and looked back. The sky was now full of enemy aircraft. They were no longer attacking in formation. They were hunting him. 15, 18. More than 20 Zeros spread across the airspace, climbing, diving, searching for angles. Walsh was alone in the center of it all, a single dark blue fighter, carving through the chaos. He checked his ammunition counters, down 400 rounds. He had fired 4 less than 5 seconds total. This was going to be a long fight. Walsh pulled the throttle back just enough to cool the engine, then shoved it forward again and climbed. He needed altitude. Altitude meant options. Speed meant life. Below him, the Zeros regrouped, forming loose attack elements. They had learned something now. They would not let him escape upward again. The next attack would come from all directions. Walsh reached 17,000 feet and leveled off, the Corsair's engine settling into a deep, steady roar. The air was thinner here, cooler, but the advantage was shrinking. The Zeros below him were climbing fast now, their pilots fully alert, coordinating through hand signals and short radio calls. They were no longer surprised, they were angry. The Japanese pilots split into multiple attack elements, to climb to engage from above. Several stayed low, waiting for Walsh to commit to a dive. Others spread wide, attempting to box him in and force him into a turning fight, the one thing the Corsair could not survive against in such numbers. Walsh scanned constantly, high, low, left, right. The sky had become three-dimensional, hostile in every direction. He felt sweat inside his gloves, despite the altitude. This was no longer about marksmanship. It was about energy management, timing, and refusing every trap the enemy set. The first attack came from his 11 o'clock high. To Zeros dove steeply, sunlight flashing off their wings. Walsh rolled right and down, forcing them to overshoot. Tracers passed behind him. He pulled up sharply, reversed, and fired a 1-second burst as 10 crossed his sights. Hits sparked along the fuselage. The Japanese fighter snapped into a dive, smoke trailing. Walsh didn't stay to confirm the kill. 3 more Zeros came in immediately from below, climbing hard. Walsh shoved the throttle to the stop and dove straight through them. The Corsair screamed past 420 miles per hour. The airframe shook violently, but held. The Zeros fell behind, unable to match the speed without risking structural failure. At the bottom of the dive, Walsh pulled out and climbed again. Up, down, strike, escape. The pattern repeated over and over. Every pass cost him speed, ammunition, and fuel. Every mistake would cost him his life. A Zero flashed across his nose at close range. Walsh fired instinctively. The rounds tore through the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The fighter pitched violently and fell away, uncontrolled. That was his 20th kill, but Walsh didn't know it yet. There was no time to count. The Japanese pilots adapted. Instead of chasing him individually, they began attacking in waves. One group forced him to dive. Another waited below to intercept. A third climbed above to cut off his escape. It was classic swarm tactics: overwhelm the enemy's decision-making, force him into a fatal error. Walsh felt the Corsair shudder. A sharp impact echoed through the fuselage. A 7.7 mm round punched through the right wing, tearing fabric and metal. Another struck the fuselage behind the cockpit. No fire, no fuel leak. Still flyable. But the message was clear. They were getting closer. Walsh checked his fuel gauge, down to 160 gallons. His ammunition counters showed less than half remaining. The fight had been going on for more than 15 minutes. Far longer than anyone could survive alone. Below him, the Zeros regrouped again, fewer now, but still more than enough. Smoke trails marked the sky where aircraft had fallen. The once pristine formation was gone, replaced by chaos and wreckage. Walsh had disrupted them completely, but disruption was no longer enough. He needed to break contact or finish the fight decisively. Then he saw it. To Zeros climbing slowly, separated from the main group. Pilots struggling to regain altitude, vulnerable. Walsh rolled inverted, lined up his dive, and committed. This pass would decide everything. Walsh pushed the Corsair into a steep dive, nose down, wings steady, the horizon spinning slowly as gravity took over. Airspeed surged past 380, 400 miles per hour. The 2 Zeros ahead of him were still climbing, their pilots unaware that the fight had just shifted against them. He selected the trailing aircraft. At 500 yards, he steadied the sight. At 300, he fired. The Corsair's 6 Brownings hammered in unison. Tracers ripped into the Zero's engine section. The Nakajima Sake seized instantly. The propeller froze. The aircraft yawed violently, and then burst into flame. The pilot never bailed out. Walsh snapped past the wreckage, rolled hard, and pulled up before the remaining Zeros could react. The second Zero tried to turn. It never completed the maneuver. Walsh reversed and fired again, a short, brutal burst. The rounds walked across the cockpit and wing route. The fighter folded inward and dropped into the clouds below. In less than 10 seconds, 2 more enemy aircraft were gone. The psychological effect was immediate. The remaining Japanese pilots hesitated, For the first time since the engagement began, Walsh sensed uncertainty in their movements. Attacks became less coordinated, fighters broke away early. Several Zeros began climbing defensively instead of pressing in. Walsh exploited it. He climbed aggressively, forcing the Zeros to follow, then rolled and dove through them again. Each pass scattered the group further. Each burst forced them to evade instead of attack. The Corsair was no longer the hunted, it was dictating the fight. But the cost was rising. Walsh's right wing vibrated at high speed. A control cable had been nicked. The stick felt heavier. His coolant and oil temperatures were creeping upward as he kept the engine at combat power for too long. He checked ammunition. Less than 900 rounds remaining. Perhaps 6 more firing passes. Below him, the remaining Zeros regrouped, fewer now, but still dangerous. Some trailed smoke. Others showed patch damage from earlier engagements. These were no longer confident hunters. They were survivors trying to disengage, with honor intact. Walsh had a decision to make. He could break away now, preserve the aircraft, and claim his kills, or he could stay. Stay and make sure none of them recovered. He stayed. He dove again, firing at a Zero that tried to roll beneath him. The rounds missed, but the maneuver forced the fighter into a spin. Walsh climbed once more, refusing to be drawn into a turning fight. Minutes stretched. Fuel continued to burn. The sun climbed higher. Then, suddenly, the fight changed again. Walsh felt a violent jolt. The Corsair lurched left. Warning lights flickered. A Zero had finally found its mark. A burst of 7.7mm rounds tore into the fuselage, puncturing an oil line behind the engine. Oil pressure began to fall, not rapidly, but enough to notice. This was no longer a matter of winning. It was now a race against time. Walsh still had altitude, still had speed, still had enemies around him, but the Corsair was wounded. And wounded aircraft do not forgive hesitation. Walsh turned south, climbing hard one last time, drawing the remaining Zeros upward. If this fight was going to end, he would end it on his terms. Walsh leveled off at 19,000 feet, higher than he had been at any point in the engagement. The Corsair's engine vibrated faintly now, a subtle tremor transmitted through the control stick and rudder pedals. The oil pressure needle had dropped below normal operating range and continued to sink. Not fast enough to force an immediate bailout, but fast enough to put a hard limit on how much fight remained in the aircraft. He checked his fuel. Just over 120 gallons. His ammunition counters showed fewer than 600 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. The fight had been going on for more than 20 minutes. Below him, the sky was quieter. The remaining Zeros, perhaps 10 now, were scattered across several thousand feet of altitude. Some were breaking away entirely, heading north towards safer airspace. Others lingered, uncertain whether to pursue or disengage. Walsh watched them carefully. The Corsair was bleeding oil. Every second at high power was killing the engine. If he reduced throttle to preserve it, he would lose speed and become vulnerable. If he kept pushing, the engine might seize over enemy territory. There was no perfect choice. Walsh pushed the throttle forward. The Zeros took the bait, climbing hard to intercept him from below. Walsh rolled left, then dove straight at them. Closing speed was extreme. Tracers flashed past his canopy. He fired a half-second burst. One Zero snapped into a spin, trailing smoke. The second broke away just in time. That burst cost him 80 rounds. His oil pressure dropped again. A warning light flickered red, then stayed on. Walsh pulled up sharply, climbing away, but the Corsair's response was slower now. The engine wasn't delivering full power anymore. The climb rate fell off. He could feel it. He could hear it. The remaining Zeros noticed too. 3 of them dove on him at once. Walsh rolled inverted and pushed the nose down, diving for speed. The Corsair accelerated, but not like before. He reached 380 miles per hour, still fast, but no longer untouchable. Tracers passed close. One round struck the tail. Another punched through the left wing. No fire, still flying, but the margin was gone. Walsh leveled out low, then climbed shallowly, refusing to commit to any turn. His tactics narrowed. No more long firing passes. No more aggressive climbs. He was now flying defensively, managing energy second by second. The Zeros pressed harder. One flashed past his left wing, so close Walsh could see the pilot's face behind the canopy glass. Another fired from below. The rounds missed, but the message was clear. They sensed weakness. Walsh knew what came next. If he stayed, the engine would fail. If it failed here, surrounded by enemy fighters, he would have seconds before impact or capture. He turned south, not a retreat and escape. The Zeros followed. Walsh pushed the Corsair to the edge of what the engine could still give. Oil pressure dropped further. The engine note grew uneven. Every vibration felt louder, harsher. Then it happened. A sharp metallic clatter echoed from the engine compartment. The Corsair shuddered violently. The oil pressure needle fell to 0. The engine was dying. Walsh had no altitude to waste and no friendly fighters nearby. He was still over hostile water and jungle. The Zeros closed in, circling, waiting for the inevitable. They did not fire. They were waiting for him to fall. Walsh reduced throttle slightly, trying to nurse the engine. The Corsair held speed barely. Smoke began to trail faintly from the cowling. This fight was no longer about victory. It was about survival. And survival would demand something no pilot had trained for. Walsh eased the Corsair into a shallow descent, careful not to shock the failing engine. With oil pressure at 0, every rotation of the massive Pratt and Whitney radial was grinding metal against metal. The engine still produced power, but only because inertia and momentum had not yet betrayed him. How long that would last was impossible to know. He checked his position. Friendly territory lay to the south, beyond a stretch of ocean and scattered islands controlled by Japanese forces. At his current altitude and speed, he had perhaps 15 minutes of flight time, as the engine didn't seize first. Behind him, the Zeros remained, 6 of them now. They flew loosely, circling above and behind, maintaining position just outside gun range. They were no longer trying to shoot him down. They were waiting for gravity and mechanics to do their work. A powerless Corsair would be easy prey. Walsh kept his speed high, trading altitude for momentum. The Corsair sliced through humid air at 290 miles per hour. Smoke thickened from the cowling, streaking along the fuselage and past the cockpit. The smell of burning oil crept inside. His eyes watered, his throat burned. He slid the canopy open slightly. The slipstream cleared the smoke, but increased drag. Air roared into the cockpit, tearing at his helmet and oxygen mask. Walsh clenched his jaw and focused on the horizon. The engine coughed, once, twice, then steadied again. Every cough stole another second from him. Below, the jungle gave way to water. Sunlight reflected off the sea, blinding and beautiful and utterly indifferent. Walsh held the Corsair low. Knowing that altitude was now a currency, he could no longer afford to spend too early. The Zeros dipped lower too, staying with him. One drifted closer, off his right wing. The Japanese pilot turned his head and looked directly at Walsh, close enough to see the red sun on the fuselage. Close enough to gesture. The pilot pointed downward. Land, ditch, surrender. Walsh ignored him. He pushed the throttle forward again, just a fraction. The engine responded with a violent shudder, then stabilized. Smoke darkened, oil splattered across the windscreen. Walsh wiped it away with a gloved hand, smearing it into a translucent haze. He was flying blind now, guided by shapes and instinct. Minutes passed like hours. The engine temperature climbed. Without oil, Internal friction generated heat faster than the cooling system could remove it. Walsh knew the science. He had seen engines seize before. The sudden lock, the propeller freezing, the violent yaw. When it happened, it would happen without warning. The Zeros tightened their circle. Walsh descended to 5,000 feet. Then 4,000. He wanted options. A ditching was survivable at low speed. A bailout was not. Japanese patrol boats operated everywhere in these waters. The engine sputtered again. This time, it did not recover immediately. Walsh leaned the mixture slightly, coaxing the engine. It caught again, rough but alive. The airspeed held at 260 miles per hour. Ahead, faint and distant, he saw it, a strip of land. An American-held island, home. The Zeros saw it too. Two broke away, climbing sharply. The others stayed for a moment longer, then turned north, satisfied. Their hunt was over. The Corsair was leaving their world. Walsh was alone again, but alone with a dying engine. He began a shallow climb, just enough to clear the coastline. The Corsair protested, vibration increasing, smoke pouring out now in thick black streams. The engine was on borrowed time. Walsh steadied the aircraft, lined up toward the airfield, and prepared himself for whatever came next. Because landing a damaged Corsair was never simple. And this one might not stay airborne long enough to try. Walsh was less than 10 miles from the airfield when the engine finally betrayed him. It began with a sharp bang, metal striking metal inside the cowling, followed by a sudden surge of vibration so violent it blurred his vision. The Corsair lurched as if struck by an invisible hand. Smoke exploded from the seams of the engine cowling, thick and black, instantly engulfing the nose of the aircraft. Then flames appeared. Orange fire licked back along the fuselage, drawn by the slipstream. Burning oil vaporized and ignited, feeding the flames. The cockpit filled with acrid smoke, choking and hot. Walsh tasted metal and fuel. His eyes burned. Engine fire. Standard procedure was clear. Throttle closed. Mixture cut. Electrical systems off. Bailout. Walsh did none of those things. He was too low. At this altitude, bailing out meant drifting into jungle or sea controlled by Japanese forces. Survival would be measured in minutes, not days. The Corsair was his only chance. Walsh pulled the mixture control back sharply, starving the engine. The flames diminished, flickering and shrinking as fuel flow dropped. He counted silently 1, 2, 3, then pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, nearly quit, then roared back to life, rough, uneven, but alive. The fire retreated, reduced to heavy smoke. Oil pressure remained at 0. Engine temperature climbed rapidly, well beyond redline. Walsh ignored the gauges. They no longer mattered. He needed distance, he needed altitude, and he needed time. The Corsair was now flying on momentum and mechanical stubbornness alone. Every second aloft was a gift that could be revoked without warning. Walsh adjusted his course slightly, lining up with the airfield ahead. The runway was visible now, a pale strip cutting through green jungle. Smoke poured from his engine like a beacon. Ground crews would already be watching. Walsh tried lowering the landing gear. Nothing happened. The hydraulic system relied on engine power. With the engine barely producing anything, hydraulic pressure was insufficient. The gear stayed locked in the wells. He tried again. Still nothing. The engine shuddered violently. Flames flickered again inside the cowling. Walsh pulled the mixture back briefly, then forward once more, suppressing the fire just enough to keep flying. Altitude, 3,500 feet. Distance to runway, 5 miles. The Corsair was not going to make a normal approach. Walsh reached for the manual hydraulic pump mounted beside the cockpit. He began pumping with his left hand, while holding the control stick steady with his right. 5 strokes, 10, 15. Nothing. The aircraft began to sink. Airspeed dropped. Smoke thickened again, curling into the cockpit despite the open canopy. Walsh coughed. his lungs burning. Carbon monoxide and smoke were robbing him of strength and clarity. He secured the control stick with his knee and pumped harder. 20 strokes. A dull thump echoed beneath the fuselage. The left main gear extended. Walsh kept pumping. 25. 30. The right main gear dropped into place. The Corsair lurched slightly as drag increased. Airspeed fell dangerously close to stall speed. But the gear was down. Walsh allowed himself one breath. Then the engine faltered again. The fire reignited, brighter this time, feeding on whatever oil remained. Smoke poured past the canopy. Walsh knew he was out of time. He aimed for the runway and committed. Whatever happened next, it would happen on the ground. The Corsair descended toward the airfield trailing a thick plume of smoke, its engine coughing unevenly, each rotation sounding more fragile than the last. Walsh held the aircraft steady with small, precise inputs, fighting vibration and fading responsiveness. The runway lay straight ahead, close now, but still unforgivingly distant. Altitude, 1,800 feet. Airspeed, 155 miles per hour. Engine condition, critical. Walsh resisted every instinct to slow down. Without flaps and with battle damage, the Corsair would stall abruptly if mishandled. He needed speed to keep the wings flying even. It meant a harder landing. The engine sputtered again, then quit. Silence replaced the roar. The propeller windmilled, then slowed, then froze. The Corsair became a glider, a poor one. The F4U's glide ratio, under ideal conditions, was barely 8:1. With the landing gear extended, smoke damage, and torn skin disrupting airflow, Walsh had far less. He was still over land, but short of the runway threshold. Too low to circle, too slow to extend. The runway was less than a mile away. Walsh lowered the nose slightly, trading what little altitude remained for speed. The Corsair responded sluggishly. The damaged engine added drag even without power. Every foot of ground passed faster than it should have. The ground crew at the airfield had stopped working. They stood frozen, watching the smoke-trailing Corsair approach, uncertain whether it would reach the runway or plow into the jungle short of the field. Fire crews rolled toward the edge of the strip, engines running, hoses ready. Walsh crossed the runway threshold at barely 90 feet, too low, too fast, too steep. He flared as best he could, pulling back gently, fighting the aircraft's desire to drop its nose. The Corsair sank hard. The left main wheel struck first, followed by the right. The impact slammed Walsh into his harness. The landing gear groaned, struts compressing violently. The right gear collapsed. The Corsair lurched sideways. The right wing dipped, scraping the runway in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. The aircraft ground looped sharply, spinning nearly 180 degrees as rubber, steel, and aluminum screamed against concrete. Then it stopped. Smoke billowed around the cockpit. For several seconds, nothing moved. Ground crews rushed in, expecting flames, expecting the worst. Fire trucks surrounded the wreck, foam nozzles raised. Inside the cockpit, Walsh sat motionless, then his hands moved. He released his shoulder straps, shoved the canopy the rest of the way back, and stood unsteady, but alive. He climbed out onto the left wing, stumbled, and was caught by two ground crewmen as his legs finally gave out. The fire never came. The engine had burned itself dry. Walsh was led away as crews doused the smoking wreck. When they opened the cowling, the damage told the story. The Pratt & Whitney engine was destroyed. Pistons seized, cylinders scored, oil lines ruptured. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage and wings. The Corsair would never fly again. But the mission was over. Walsh had returned. And only now, standing on solid ground, did the cost of the fight begin to sink in. Walsh was escorted to the squadron area as medics checked him for injuries. Aside from smoke inhalation, dehydration, and bruising from the hard landing, he was largely unhurt. His flight suit, however, told a different story, streaked with oil, blackened by smoke, and torn at the cuffs from hours of strain and heat. Behind him, the Corsair was being examined. Maintenance crews counted the damage carefully. More than a dozen bullet holes punctured the fuselage and wings. One round had severed an oil line behind the engine. Another had punched through the cowling, spraying oil directly onto the exhaust, igniting the fire that nearly killed him. Control cables showed partial damage. The aircraft had been flying on borrowed time long before Walsh ever saw the runway. Intelligence officers arrived within the hour. They sat Walsh down with water and asked him to reconstruct the fight: time, altitude, number of enemy aircraft, direction of attack, ammunition expended. Walsh spoke calmly, methodically, as if describing a training sortie rather than a battle that had nearly ended his life. He estimated he had engaged more than 20 Zeros. Confirmed kills were harder to determine. Gun camera footage showed at least 4 aircraft destroyed outright. Several others were damaged badly enough that they likely failed to return to base. Japanese loss records later supported his account. The engagement had cost the enemy multiple fighters at a time when Japan could least afford them. But numbers told only part of the story. The Japanese fighter sweep had been broken. No follow-on attacks occurred that day. American transports and bombers operated without interference. Ground installations remained untouched. One pilot, flying alone, had forced an entire enemy formation to disengage. Word spread quickly. Among the pilots of VMF-124 and neighboring squadrons, Walsh's fight became immediate legend. Not because of bravado but because of discipline. He had never panicked, never chased a kill into a trap, never tried to outturn a Zero. He had fought the enemy aircraft, the engine, and the clock with equal precision. Higher headquarters took notice. Within days, Walsh was pulled from frontline duty. Not as punishment, but as preservation. The Marine Corps could not afford to lose a pilot of his experience. He was ordered home to the United States. In Washington, the story was reviewed at the highest levels. The recommendation was clear: for extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, and complete disregard for personal safety in aerial combat against overwhelming enemy forces, First Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh would receive the nation's highest decoration. On February 8, 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented Walsh with the Medal of Honor. The citation summarized what the sky over the Solomons had already proven: that on a single day in 1943, one Marine aviator had held the line alone. But Walsh never claimed he had done anything special. He had simply done what the situation demanded. Kenneth Walsh stood quietly in the squadron hangar after the mission, surrounded by mechanics, fellow pilots, and the remnants of the Corsair that had carried him through hell. The aircraft was battered, smoking, and scarred with bullet holes, a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Yet for Walsh, the machine itself was secondary. It had been a tool, a partner, a vehicle through which he could impose order on chaos and survive against impossible odds. The F4U Corsair, nicknamed the Angel of Death by the Japanese for its distinctive gull wing and sheer power, had earned a reputation in the Pacific theater: fast, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing more punishment than any fighter of its era. It was a pilot's aircraft in capable hands. Walsh had proven that day that human skill, courage, and tactical intelligence mattered more than any technical specification. A good pilot could turn a great machine into an instrument of survival and lethality. A great pilot could do it against overwhelming odds. News of his Medal of Honor spread quickly, and his story became a benchmark for Marine aviators. Walsh returned to the United States, continuing to train new pilots in the Corsair's nuances, preparing them for the Pacific skies, where air supremacy was often decided by a few minutes and a few hundred feet of altitude. He remained humble, insisting that every pilot in VMF-124 had contributed to the successes in the Solomons, that no single ace could have done it alone. Yet history would remember him as a defining figure in the war at sea and in the air. In the months following his heroic engagement, Walsh continued flying combat missions, achieving multiple aerial victories and cementing his status as one of the Marine Corps' leading aces. He understood that survival depended not on heroics alone, but on discipline, energy management, situational awareness, and the relentless assessment of risk versus reward. His actions inspired countless others to embrace these principles. The legacy of that day extends beyond medals and records. It is a story of courage under fire, of ingenuity in life-threatening circumstances, and of the bond between pilots and aircraft. The Corsair, once a machine among many, became a symbol of tactical superiority when wielded by a pilot of exceptional skill. Walsh's engagement against 20+ Zeros in 1943 demonstrated that superior numbers do not guarantee victory when determination, skill, and courage intervene. Today, historians, military enthusiasts, and aviation fans continue to study the battle over the Solomon Islands, analyzing Walsh's tactics, the performance of the Corsair, and the psychology of dogfighting against overwhelming odds. His story remains a touchstone for the enduring principle: in aerial combat, technology is crucial, but courage and skill often tip the scales between life and death. Kenneth Walsh, his F4U Corsair, and the memory of that one extraordinary engagement stand as timeless reminders that even in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, human resolve can make the impossible possible.